Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary. So recently we worked on a demake of my original Backrooms project, and it featured a level generation technique that would convert images into usable data for room layouts. Today's project aims to expand on that concept while also taking inspiration from an indie game called Guild of Dungeoneering. Now, before we get too far into things, remember to leave a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Also, make sure notifications are turned on so you never miss future videos. Now, for the sake of simplicity, the only thing that we're taking from the Guild of Dungeoneering is the room placement concept. Now, there's actually way more to the game than just placing rooms, and it's actually quite fun, highly recommended. But anyway, you may be able to see where we are going with this. So first, our image generation technique has been modified since the last time we saw it. Now it takes into consideration blank spaces, which in the code basically boils down to not being the colors black or white. Added to this is a second layout sprite, which will be used for enemy spawns. And so just like in Guild of Dungeoneering, the player is given a random handful of rooms to place into the world. Placement is restricted to predetermined sizes because otherwise generation could actually lock the game up. Again, this method is pretty volatile if not done properly. Anyway, placing a room triggers so many different functions, so let's start with the initial placement function itself. This is a general function that builds the room based on either a given type or one chosen at random. Once it's been determined, another function is called to actually create the room. The room itself is treated as its own unique entity with its own list of monsters and loot, which themselves are either determined when the function is called or chosen randomly. So if that room needs to generate monsters, another function is called. The monster spawn function then determines which of those monster layouts from the start are possible. For example, if it's a hallway, only one or two layouts are chosen, whereas more open designs allow for more variation. Now, once a layout has been chosen, each marked space is a chance to spawn an enemy for that room. These monsters are then added to and kept track of via the room's monsters list. And finally, in general, if no monsters exist in a room, including their defeat, yet there is loot to be awarded, said loot is automatically awarded to the player. Loot can consist of anything from gold to health potions and even strength potions, which we'll get to later. Now, this entire project is actually built in one object, meaning both the player and monsters are not unique objects. Instead, they are simply giant chunks of code created using the same function with some mild differences. For example, everything has stats for health, attack, and defense numbers, but there are also specifics, such as the player's control, which allows for four-way grid movement using W, A, S, and D. The player can also use health and strength potions, which in particular will temporarily increase their damage output using Z and X respectively. That is assuming that they have any items to use, which are stored in the player's bag array. So again, player movement is constricted to the grid, which allows us to somewhat compartmentalize possible actions, kinda like in old school RPG like Final Fantasy or Pokemon, or even back when computers could only, display two colors. Anyway, an example of this is if the tile that the player wants to move to is a wall, they won't be able to. Or if that tile is occupied by a monster, then a whole battle system is triggered. First, calculations based on attack and defense values are done for player and enemy monster. The damage is then applied to both parties, followed by health status checks. If the player is defeated, it's game over and everything resets. If a monster is defeated, it is removed from that room's monster list. And if it's the final monster in the room, then loot is awarded to the player if applicable. And of course, if the tile is empty and it doesn't lead to the void, the player can move no problem. And finally, any notable events like loot being awarded or a battle taking place, that information is recorded to a temporary list that displays what's happening at the bottom left of the screen. Now, no doubt that there are a lot of questions in regards to some of the design decisions made for this project. Truth is, this was much more of a prototype test than anything else. The main goal was to expand on the initial layout generation concept and add some functionality on top to gauge potential, and I can safely say that there is a ton of potential. Now, there are legitimate concerns to be had, such as being dealt a hand of rooms that are incompatible. There are also currently no checks to make sure that paths between rooms match up, which I think may be able to be fixed with adding even more checks and marks to the blueprints. But secondly, this was also a test for a potential tile-based interactivity system, and so we definitely succeeded on those two fronts, which is great because that means we can only get better and more efficient from here on out. In fact, there was more content planned for the project, but figuring out the rest of this just took too long to put together. Speaking of which, I don't think we'll be continuing with this project in particular, but you can bet we'll be seeing remnants of what was done today in future projects. So let me know what you thought of the process, and share any stories of your own random generation endeavors or anything else on your mind in the comments. Also, if you would like to play the game that inspired this rabbit hole, as well as a bunch of other games previously featured on the channel, or maybe you'd like early access to the weekly videos, subscribe to my Patreon for instant access to all that good stuff. With that said, brings us to the end of today's Dev Diary, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.